took a long time to get this ministry to this point. And when it happened, it was a blast. Madam Toastmaster, fellow Toastmasters, I want to go through a little bit of the history of this ministry at our former church, Parents' Night Out, and my role in it. And at the end, give you 3 lessons that I learned as part of that role and what I learned from that ministry. After my wife and I were married, we joined First Christian Church in Northwest Rochester. And in 1989, we called Richard Sagracy to be pastor of that church. After Richard had been on staff for a couple years, he started to come up with ideas about how to make our church more visible in the community. It was a small church, and we tried to find ways to get it more noticed in the community. One of the programs that we discussed doing was called Parents' Night Out, which would be drop-in babysitting day and Friday evening so families could have a chance to go out and not be charged for daycare. We decided to go forward. We received some funding to update the toys we had in our church and to update some of the facilities. We didn't have a lot of money for advertising, so we had to be creative on how we advertised the program. Dixie Cable, who was a member of our church, took the committee, and she did a lot of work to get the procedures in place, to get the insurance straightened out, because that was the biggest issue we were concerned with, is how would our insurance policy handle this type of activity where people were bringing their children in, and how to cover that. But we did get approval from our insurance company to do that. Dixie did a work through and found the agencies we started working with. After about the first couple of years, we had received some success with it. We had a couple families would come every month, but not to the degree that we thought we'd see. We thought this was a program that would meet a need in the community, and we just never seemed to be able to get traction with it in the community. After about the 3rd year where Dixie ran it, she moved back to Iowa to be closer to her parents, and they were looking for people in the church to take this ministry and this committee. And at first I kept thinking a little bit like Nick talked about, where I don't have the time for this. I've got young children. I don't have the time to run this. And I kept feeling the call to take it. And eventually I said, I'll do it. I felt there was still a lot of merit in this program. So I took it and did many of the same things that Dixie did. Went to the same agencies, handed out the same material. And even my first year running it, it struggled. We had couple of families every night, every month, and the worst night was probably in May. We had one family sign up and went there, and it was a rainy night, and stayed there 30 minutes. The family never showed up, and was really discouraged at the end of that. And talked to Richard about it, and we said, well, we'll give it one more year. We won't do anything in the summer. We'll start in September and see what happens, and because we felt like we've run our course with it. September came of 97, and things changed. Started getting more families, new families, didn't have the cancellations, the no-shows. And by about December, we were averaging up to 20 to 30 children in our church at this event. So we had to make some changes. We had to set up a room just for registration and hand out name tags and sign forms and check children in and check children out. Set up a nursery, and it was funny, the nursery was always the most popular place for our volunteers to work. You know, especially for the women. I always could get volunteers for the nursery. I could never get volunteers in some of the other places, but especially running the games for older children. We set up games. We set up a movie room in our library, and I think if Disney were realizing how much we showed of that, we'd be having to pay for copyright violations. We would set up food at 8 o'clock, and often food became a night where we'd try to teach manners at the same time, and that was always a tricky part. And it was fun. I mean, it was a blast having that many children come in and interacting from a variety of backgrounds within the city. By July of 1998, we had a Post-Bulletin reporter and writer come to one of our events, and that was written up in an August issue of the Post-Bulletin. And the second year continued much like the same. We continued to have strong turnout, strong results. Richard went ahead and submitted our name to our national convention, because there was a group at our national meeting called Mission Fest, where 50 different missions from across the country were going to be selected to show their project, and we were selected as one of them. So in October of 1999, we traipsed to Cincinnati. That's where this banner comes from. That was one of the banners that we showed at Cincinnati. And we showed this poster board. And when I went back and looked at it, and I thought, yeah, I did have to put numbers on the poster board. So this is the Post Bulletin article. This shows the change in the program. And I'll set this up on the side so you can see it later, because I know it's going to be difficult to read, but this shows the change that happened in that year. And so it was a blast. We set up the booth and ran it 2 times, handed out material to a lot of different congregations and ministers there, and got to see how a national convention works. A lot of boring business meetings, a few good sermons, a little bit of service. We'd helped with a church that was going through some rebuild in Cincinnati, so it was a good time. So I got to run the committee 1 more year, and they gave me a grace period so I could be on the committee when we took this to Cincinnati. And it continued to do well. In 2000, my term was up and another person took over, and it was continuing to do well, but at that time there was conflict starting in our church. And in 2001, Richard took a new position in Kankakee, Illinois. And at that time, my family also left the church. We realized that there was a history of conflict in the church and past ministers with Richard, and our view was that that conflict was going to continue in the future and wasn't going to be changed. So the people that stayed at First Christian ran Parents' Night Out for a couple more years until their membership got to the point where they couldn't support it anymore. The church closed in 2006, and Bear Creek Services has bought the building and property. And if you remember Debbie O'Meara, who was a member here, that's where she works. And that was the first lesson that I learned from all this was it was really hard to walk away from the ministry when we left. I had invested a lot of time in the ministry, and it was really hard to let it go. But I began to realize that there was a time to be involved when I took the committee, and there was also a time to let go. And that was really hard, but what was best for my family and best for us at that time was to leave and trust that God would continue to use it in whatever means He saw good. The second lesson I learned is I'm trying to poke a little bit of fun at myself for numbers, because we tended to measure this a lot on numbers. Did we succeed from number-wise? But some people would say, well, you never got any members out of this. You never had people that joined your church because you ran the program. And I said, that's true. We never had a lot of visitors that attended services. But when you see the quotes on this board of the people who were asked for their thoughts on the ministry, that's where the success to me comes in. It's not a numbers version of success. It's a version of success that talks about what we offered to those families to help them during times in their family where they probably needed a break at times to offer daycare to get out. So at times I get hung up on numbers, but the success was really in what we saw in the people that attended. The third lesson I learned was to be quiet. Because this was, for me, kind of heady stuff. You know, getting written up in the Post Bulletin, selected for this national convention, and it was almost tempting to say that I took a lot of credit for it. When the turnaround happened that I showed you on the board, nothing changed. We talked to the same agencies, we did the same advertising, we couldn't afford the Post Bulletin, we couldn't afford a spot on KTTC. We talked to the same agencies, and yet the results were completely different from one year to the next. Now, some people thought, well, maybe you guys have traction in these agencies now, they can trust you, they know you're doing good and you're not trying to set up some kind of scheme. Fine, I'll accept that. But I also believe that we need to give God credit where God was acting. And so I'm going to be quiet and let God have the credit for what happened there for those 3 years. Benjamin Franklin said, either do something worth reading about, or write something worth reading. And I thought about that quote in terms of Parents' Night Out, and I thought maybe the way to paraphrase that quote is be involved in something worth speaking about. I was fortunate to be involved with this program for those 4 years. It was worthwhile to me, and I believe it was worthwhile to the people that we served. Madam Toastmaster.